Why do we save money? Why do we give to particular sorts of things? Is it for the sake of the things surviving to the next generation, or is it for the sake of us becoming the kind of people that God has called us to be? But I think the real temptation is we just want this thing to keep going. We want this thing to continue to survive. Those are two things that we have to hold together, that yes, God is faithful, and yes, God is present, and that does not necessarily entail institutional survival. Doors can close, and yet God can be faithful at the same time.
Welcome to the Last Service Podcast. I'm your host, Matt. You may have heard that American churches are closing at a pace faster than new churches are opening. In fact, it is estimated that over 4,000 churches will close this year. The need for thoughtful conversations about the declining church in America is more crucial than ever. On this podcast, we explore the stories of American churches that have closed, consolidated, or merged. But this isn't a tale of despair. It's a celebration of good endings, enduring legacies, and the courage to embrace new beginnings. This is not the end. Welcome back to the Last Service Podcast, everyone. My guest today is Dr. Myles Werntz. I'm looking forward to talking with you about scarcity in the church. I came across a recent article in Christianity Today, which was fantastically written. I believe it was called Scarcity's Strange Gifts. And I thought, I've got to talk to this guy. So I reached out, we got connected. But before we dive in, would you take a minute to introduce yourself? Tell us about your career, your family life, all of that.
Yeah. My name is Myles Werntz. I am Associate Professor of Theology at Abilene Christian University in Abilene, Texas, where I've been for the last 4 years. So I did my PhD in theology and ethics, and so I teach and write kind of broadly in both of those areas. Married with 2 kids, Elliot and Arthur. Wife is a counselor, and we make our home happily in Abilene, Texas.
Excellent. We have had a string of Texans on this podcast, which is always fun. There's a lot of you, and there's a lot of you involved in doing good church work too. So great. Glad to have you.
Yeah.
All righty. So let's talk about this article, Scarcity's Strange Gifts. I haven't read anything similar to it, so I'm very curious to know what prompted you to write that. How did your interest find its way there, if that makes sense?
So it really began, I think the genesis for this began a couple of years ago. So my position at ACU is kind of an odd one in that I'm regular faculty, but I also do a lot of work with congregations and trying to help pair students with ministry opportunities, and just kind of trying to keep tabs on what churches are seeing and how they're navigating like post-COVID life. And I don't think this is peculiar to West Texas, but it just feels more acute to West Texas, is that there's always a shortage. It seems like there's always a shortage of everything. Particularly in my world, there is a shortage of trained ministers, which is related to a shortage of folks going into ministry training. Since the 1990s, one survey indicated that the number of people pursuing full-time training in ministry at the graduate level has gone down about 40%. So you can see how this translates downstream. You have fewer people going into ministry. That means there's fewer people to be able to work in congregations that have specific training. And then you couple that together with a lot of other things that I just kind of anecdotally see around, which is fewer folks in the pews, which correlates to a lot of work that sociologists have been noting about kind of declining attendance and the rise of the nuns and kind of the post-Christian world, which is appearing in a lot of places within the U.S., but I think is going to affect everything everywhere. So you put all those things together, and then you put those into conversation with an economic backdrop of inflation and decreased giving and people feeling constraints on their budgets and on their time, and you just wind up with a culture in which everything feels constrained and scarce at every level. And so it can't but help affect the way that church plays itself out. That there are fewer people, fewer resources, fewer trained ministers, less time. Um, People have more things competing for their attention. So there's two researchers that I got interested as I kind of began to notice the confluence of all these things. I just became really interested in what effects is this actually having on the way in which Christians operate, right? How is scarcity affecting our moral lives? How is scarcity affecting the choices we make? How is scarcity affecting the decisions that institutions make regarding the kinds of things that they think are important or the kinds of ministers that they want to pursue? Um, One of the really interesting things for me to see in kind of all of this is the way in which churches are navigating kind of a paucity of trained ministers, and they're doing it in a few different ways. They're getting folks on staff that don't have any theological education, or they're getting the ministers who are coming into positions have less theological education than previous generations, or they are specifically prioritizing things that don't require theological education. They're just kind of navigating that scarcity in a whole lot of ways, and so I just became really interested in what kinds of effects is this having. We just feel like everything is really constrained and scarce on a whole lot of levels. How is this all shaking out?
Yeah.
So that led me to, for the last year and a half, I've been involved with a grant through the Templeton Foundation, which does a lot of work with science and religion. And this grant is particularly was interested in getting theologians and ethicists conversant with psychological science. And I thought, okay, I had run across a book by two researchers, Mullinathon and Shafir, who I referenced in the article, who for the last couple of decades now have been doing a lot of work on the psychology of scarcity and found their conclusions pretty compelling. And I thought, okay, I think this could be a really valuable tool toward me being able to practically address some of the things that I'm seeing, and to be able to possibly put some tools into some hands of ministers to be able to navigate this, what seems to be a pervasive condition, not just kind of like not just a blip on the radar, but a condition that many of them are finding themselves in persistently. So that's kind of where this article came out of, is just observing what was happening around, getting involved with a grant that has allowed me to kind of do some reading. I'm going to keep going with this and kind of do some more work with it over the next few years. But just being concerned with how scarcity is affecting the moral imagination and the moral lives of churches in particular.
That is so interesting. To clarify, when we're talking about scarcity in churches and the research you're doing, are you looking at a particular denomination? Are you looking at Protestant versus Catholic? What is the scope of churches you're
So
looking
the
at?
work that I do on a regular basis is with predominantly Baptist churches, of which there are scads in Texas, but also
Indeed.
non-denominational.
Yeah.
Not non-denominational, some mainline, not many Catholic or Orthodox congregations.
Gotcha.
The research that I'm hoping to do in about a year hopefully will draw in and be able to learn how this is playing itself out within those traditions as well.
Mm-hmm.
But the ones that I'm seeing it playing out in most readily are non-denominational, evangelical, kind of low church confessional kinds of places.
Yeah, it's a good way of putting it, and
Yeah,
autonomous as well.
yeah,
So
that's right.
not connected. Yeah.
That's right.
Okay, wow. So what's interesting to me about that is we tend to think about church closures, and it's true that they're happening more in mainline churches. And there was a long period where it looked like it was really the mainline churches that would skew to more of a liberal theology, experience decline and scarcity. But what you're saying is it's coming for all of us.
It's coming for everybody. And
Yeah.
I think it's an equal opportunity kind of situation. So I'm thinking now there's a number of kind of smaller communities that are outside. So Abilene is about 140,000. It's not a tiny place, but it's
Oh,
kind
wow.
of a mid-sized
Yeah. I actually
city.
thought it was bigger than that. Wow. Yeah.
So you have a lot of kind of smaller communities outside that are within 45 minutes of Abilene, many of whom are currently looking for ministers, right? And the way in which they are having to navigate this question seems to be there seem to be a lot of commonalities. They turn to volunteers. They put out ads and bulletins with very little effect, right? In part because a lot of the ministers, so I've been teaching seminarians for about 15 years now, and one of the things that I notice is predominantly when young ministers think about their first job, they don't think about kind of rural places. They don't think about kind of out of the way places. They do think about places where there are more resources, right? Um, and so I just think that it's something that's coming for. This is something that's coming. It's gonna show up some places more readily and more quickly. Places where you have other forms of scarcity already economically. But it's going to eventually, I think this is eventually going to touch everyone.
Yeah. I'm curious about your how that is playing out in rural churches, which you talked about in the article. We're going to come back to that in a minute. I'd like to jump to maybe a 30,000 foot view, because you touched on something that is very interesting and is a philosophy, a way of thinking, maybe even a theology that I've come across quite a bit in talking about churches in decline and churches that are closing. And that is the notion of sort of a connection to a prosperity gospel. So you refer to it as a tight connection between faithfulness and God's presence. And I think what you were saying was that the idea that if we are faithful in what we do, if we're living right, if our organizations are on mission and doing everything right, then God is going to be with us somehow more than not.
Right.
than
we'll survive. There'll be an abundance of resources,
and
or
there'll
at
be an
least enough
abundance, right?
resources, right? Or at least enough
Yeah.
resources to make it work, right?
Right. And you put the connection out there that is very similar to a prosperity gospel. There may be another way of looking at that at least nothing bad would happen to us if we're doing everything right.
Right.
So maybe we're not going to prosper, but we're not going to be scarce at the same time. We're not going to be rich, but we're not going to be poor,
exactly.
Which is maybe a lighter version. Do you think that notion comes from other places than just the prosperity gospel? Because I've heard that expressed by people who would never ascribe to a prosperity gospel, would completely disavow that. Yeah. And yet it somehow has crept in to our thinking.
Yeah, no, I think that I do think that there are scriptural roots to that. When Jesus says that if God cares for the sparrows and the birds of the air, why wouldn't he care for you as well? Right. That there's this,
True.
we take that and then we kind of extrapolate out. Okay. So if that means me personally, or if that means kind of us collectively, that probably has something to do with like how institutions are going to survive, right? That means that there will be enough institutionally for us to move forward. So I think that there's other places in Proverbs that link together God's faithfulness and and the preservation of the people. I think that there are scriptural roots to it. On the other hand, I have to say, okay, so places like Job, Lamentations, where places in Scripture where they just kind of want to dump a cold bucket of water on that notion that faithfulness and survival necessarily travel together. That's also there, and so I think part of it may be coming from reading kind of one aspect of the picture that Scripture presents with respect to the link between faithfulness and material abundance, and not considering the full range there. So for a number of years, I taught historical theology and some church history. And one of the things that I was always struck by was I spent a lot of time like talking about the rich and robust Christian cultures that existed in North Africa and a lot of in, in in modern day Morocco and in Libya and all these places. And now I look and say, yeah, those churches are not there. Like there was a point in time at which they were there and things were going great, and there were congregations that were robust, and now they are non-existent. Um, and so I think those are two things that we have to hold together, that yes, God is faithful and yes, God is present, and that does not necessarily entail institutional survival at the same time, right? That doors can close and yet God can be faithful at the same time. And that's a hard one, right? Because we want to knit those things together, and it comes together in a form that equates material abundance with the the faithfulness of God and the ability of Christians to be able to be Christian. Um, Now you are in fundraising. I do a good bit of fundraising for my own work, and you and I
Yeah.
both know that it is really
Talk about
easy to do
scarcity.
our. Oh man, it's really easy to do our work when there's money in the bank. It's
Yeah.
really hard to do our work when there's no funding and there's no material goods. So I don't want to
Yeah.
valorize it and say that it's this amazing opportunity and this wonderful thing that we should wholeheartedly embrace and just go looking for opportunities to embrace scarcity. Um,
Right.
I wrote the article, I think, wanting to just kind of give a bit more sober take on the situation, to say, yeah, I think this is coming. I think this is already being felt by a lot of congregations. Every time you drive through a city, I'm sure Abilene is no different than Atlanta in the sense that you probably can find vacant churches, places where there were once thriving congregations that are now repurposed buildings or just lying vacant. Um,
Yeah.
and those two things are not those. But both of those things can be true, right? That there was great faithfulness there, and those institutions are no more, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And sometimes the decline and the scarcity is brought on by bad choices or just
Yeah,
mistakes,
absolutely.
or we just
Yep.
stopped. I mean, we can demonize those.
Hmm.
Or we can say just, hey, you know what, we're people and we're systems of people and we're going to get it wrong sometimes. And then sometimes
Hmm. That's right.
scarcity is brought on by factors that are completely out of a church's control.
Yep, that's right.
And
And I
one
think
of
it's
those
that
two things
second.
will happen.
Yeah, it's kind of the second one that I'm trying to draw attention to in the article. There's definitely a kind of way of institutional decline and closure that is brought on by foolishness or by things that looked great at the time, but were a terrible idea in hindsight. But there's a lot that is just, I think, just lies outside the control of just ordinary congregations or ordinary Christian ministries trying to do their work, that have nothing to
Yeah.
do with how good the idea is or how faithful the people are. But this is just the conditions in which we're living.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, what are some of the blessings of scarcity?
So one of the interesting things about this work that these two psychologists, Mullinath and Shafir, have done is to demonstrate like how a scarcity mindset works. That it does have great costs, but it also has these kind of unintended benefits. So let me use this example. Say you have a say you are okay. So say you're 19 years old and you're in college and you have your final paper due tomorrow and you haven't started yet. I don't know what kind of student you were in school, but I'm assuming that happened to me. That I had to make that happen at one juncture. I'm sure that
Now I'm going to plead the
many of us
fifth
did.
on that one, but yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I'm sure that's not uncommon.
Yeah.
So they say, okay, so this is a good example for us to kind of see how this works. In that you have in the situation a scarcity of time. The clock is ticking. You have X amount of hours before that paper is going to be due, come hell or high water, and you have to make it happen. And so in that moment, when I'm devoting myself wholeheartedly to the task at hand, there are any number of things that I am not paying attention to in order to give myself wholeheartedly toward toward the scarcity that is confronting me. I have a scarcity of time. This has got a hard deadline. This has got to get finished. And so I'm giving myself fully to that one thing in front of me and blocking out everything else that is to the side of me, or things that probably I should be giving some form of attention to, but I'm just absolutely going to ignore them. I'm going to ignore the TV that's on. I'm going to ignore roommates. I'm going to ignore the phone calls. I'm going to ignore everything else that I probably should be paying attention to as well, in order to devote myself to the thing that is scarce in front of me. And so they say, okay, so it's obviously bad for us to neglect things that we should be paying attention to. That's kind of the cost of scarcity. But the benefit is that you will have increased attention and focus and knowledge of the thing that's in front of you. You have a more intimate understanding of the thing that you're devoting yourself to. They have done follow-up work that shows that people who have gone through specific kinds of scarcity, and there's all sorts of kind of different scarcities that they describe: relational scarcity, time scarcity, economic scarcity. Um, but when people go through those sorts of periods, they become better attuned to being able to pick up on the nonverbal cues of others who are going through the same kinds of situations. So if there's others that are experiencing like real relational forms of scarcity or loneliness or kind of depression, people who have gone through that kind of scarcity are like better attuned to be able to pick up on the cues of those that are currently going through it as well. Or they develop greater empathy. If you've gone through times of like economic scarcity, you have a greater sense of empathy toward those that are currently going through it, because you have kind of like an experiential knowledge that you've gained through having gone through that situation. From my vantage point, one of the other things that comes into play here is that there seem to be forms of virtue that really you develop the muscles for having those virtues, but they only develop when you have to, under strain or under stress. Right. So we all want to be people who are able to be courageous, or we want to be people who are patient, or we want to be people who can endure hard things. But you don't get those virtues unless you first kind of travel through those periods of privation or scarcity in this case. And so that's where I think that scarcity gives us a bunch of unintended things. It helps us to become more empathetic to those that are also struggling. It gives us kind of greater creativity to be able to say, well, I don't have an abundance of people. I don't have an abundance of money. What are the things that are the most important for us as a church or as a ministry to be able to focus on? What are the things that really matter, and what are the things which we are doing kind of as a luxury of abundant time or abundant volunteers or abundant resources that really don't, that we can just kind of let go of without a whole lot of loss. It gives a sense of like a renewed sense of focus and vision, and being able to caretake those things that really are central and matter. And I think it helps us to be creative about addressing solutions in ways that we wouldn't have necessarily wanted to like entertain, had we not been in this situation of scarce resources or scarce people, right? Two of the examples that I draw from in the piece are in 2 Corinthians and Acts, where you have, and this is both like material scarcity. You have Paul commending the church in Corinth for helping out another congregation that is experiencing times of famine, and giving to an offering. And you have in Acts, you have a couple of different times it mentions the ways in which believers joined all their possessions together and gave to each as they had need, and exercised kind of radical forms of distribution. I think these are really compelling examples, particularly when we begin to think about scarce conditions, because they open up new ways for us to think about what does it mean for a ministry to own something, or for a church to have property, or for a church to have resources? What are ways in which duplication and specification of a ministry is actually a bad thing? What might be gained from consolidation, right? Do I, in my own city, do we need to have 10 churches, each of which have their own gyms, right? Or can we think about ways in which we might be able to maintain and share an appropriate
Yeah.
number of these things? This that still provides the same level of service both to the congregations and to the surrounding communities, but you just don't need like reduplication of these sorts of things. I think there's all sorts of interesting ways materially that this opens up for churches, especially if churches are thinking about like tight budgets and the possibility of closure. That could open up that opens up some creative options for churches having to think about, well, what do we do with our stuff, and what is the relationship between our stuff and our possessions and our property, and the mission, or this vocation that God has given us.
Yeah, that's a lot to think about. As you were talking with biblical examples, correct me if I'm wrong, but Jesus' entire earthly ministry was under a context of scarcity in an overtaxed, occupied nation,
Yeah,
to people
absolutely.
who
Yep.
did not have wealth. So sort of the
Yep.
birth of Christianity was definitely in scarcity. And the
There's
church went 300 years of persecution right after that. So
Yeah, that's right. That's right. These are less than ideal times. And the Jesus's ministry was supported by benefactors and by supporters, but yet was conducted in this very context of material privation. So I was
yeah,
reading. I've been doing a lot of work with a guy named Howard Thurman. I don't know if you're familiar with that with that figure.
I'm not.
Yeah, he's kind of lesser known, but really great. He was a kind of a mystic and spiritual thinker, church leader. He was the dean of the college, or dean of the chapel at Boston University, for a long time, while Martin Luther King Jr. was there, and so he was kind of a
Oh, wow. Okay.
spiritual mentor for King while he was at Boston. And
Yeah.
so you find a lot of like influences of Thurman's writing and Thurman's work in King's own writing as well. So that's kind of like his claim to fame. A lot of people knew him during his life, but that's kind of the thing. It's like he was a strong spiritual influence
Yeah.
on Martin Luther King Jr. But in one of his best known books, he makes this claim at the very beginning that Jesus proposes a lot of radical things with respect to loving one's enemies and turning the other cheek and living with a great deal of trust in God's provision. And he does it. And the reason why he says practically the reason you can take this seriously is because Jesus was living in those kinds of situations of privation. He says he is talking to a people whose backs are against the wall. And so, being able to trust in the words of Jesus with respect to kind of this radical posture of generosity and open-handedness with our possessions and with our material resources is true for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons that it's true is that Jesus speaks from within that kind of context as well. So.
And, for where we were talking before about God's presence and faithfulness equated with abundance, doesn't it say something about the character of God, that his son was sent not in the times of abundance in the history of Israel? It was sent in the time of occupation and of when their backs were against the wall. That's
right. That's right.
Yeah. When his presence was most known. You outlined three possibilities as resources become scarce. And in some ways, they're kind of three attitudes, I guess I would say. The first one is to save, to fill the barns. The second one is to ignore it. That doesn't seem like a good idea. And the third one is to stop, just say we're done. Could you walk us through those, and what are the pitfalls for each of those? Choices?
So I think roughly, I think there's three possibilities when churches are approaching great times of scarcity. One is to pull in and to live off of. There's a number of churches that have developed endowments over the years, and so even when giving, like year-to-year giving, is low, they have ample resources to be able to kind of weather those sorts of times. That is certainly one possibility, to simply be able to kind of rise above it with kind of the accrued resources from earlier generations. Um, the question that I have for that is whether or not that is actually a missed opportunity for congregations in that time, that they have traded in the possibility for growing in trust and gratitude for survival. That you can get past that situation, but what have you gotten through it with, right? What kind of person are you on the other side? I think about this a lot particularly with like respect to the COVID experience that we've just gone through, that it could be it could have been a time for people to truly change their lives and to take stock of what they had and to make some big sweeping changes in their life. And that was true, I think, for some. But some, I think, just kind of were waiting it out, right? I'm going to tell myself that I'm going to be different, but really I'm just kind of waiting for this to pass, and then I'm going to get right back to doing the things that I was doing before, instead of that scarcity that we experienced as being a true opportunity to do something different and to behave differently. So I think that's the challenge for church for type number one, right? That you have the things to survive it, and you can kind of rise above it, but I think that there's a different kind of way forward that this situation is inviting you to, that we're just missing out on.
That's a really interesting way of looking at endowments. So as we were saying before, I've worked in nonprofits, and in fundraising, and endowments are the golden egg. Like you always want to be working towards an endowment. But here's the thing. The legal language around an endowment most of the time is in perpetuity.
Yes.
Which means that the corpus of that funding, that gift, however many millions of dollars it is, that will never get touched. And what you'll do is live off the investment returns from it in perpetuity. Right. But if we're saying that we believe churches, individual local communities of churches, don't exist in perpetuity, then
they don't.
Maybe endowments aren't a good idea. But it's so hard to find the line, because of course saving is good, right? Debt is not always a good thing. Being broke is not always a good thing. So it seems like saving is a great idea. It's responsible, but I guess what you're getting at is the motivation for which you are saving. And if we're saving with a church, if we're forming an endowment to preserve what we already have in perpetuity, we're sort of on a fool's errand. Right. But if we're saving to make future investments, to mitigate risk, and to invest in future generations of ministry, that's a little bit of a different attitude, which would then play out. It would play out legally in how you set up that endowment, first of all, because you have different exit plans for the endowment. Yeah, that's got my brain. That's got my wheels turning.
Well, I would actually frame it a little bit differently, in that I think, and so let me say full-heartedly, I am engaged in fundraising efforts for my own work at the university, and so this is always like a struggle that I have within myself when I'm working with this kind of thing, recognizing the good that comes from exercising trust and trusting that, yes, in fact, God will provide for what is needed, while also hearing the wisdom of those that say, yes, an endowment is the gold standard. It's the golden egg that continues to provide benefits, right? Kind of the running joke in higher education is that there will be some with the declining number of students that are coming into college every year in the future, there may very well be universities that can exist in perpetuity that have no students and require no students to function as well. I won't name names, but there are those universities whose endowments are so large and so outlandish
and close to Boston.
Yes, exactly. Like they will exist long after they have no students left to.
The whole campus could burn down tomorrow, and they could rebuild it, and they would still have an endowment left over.
There'll be a hedge fund that has a few students attached to it. So that's one. That's kind of the concern that I have, is that you have you kind of lose the script. You lose the intent for, like, why do we save money? Like, why do we raise funds for a particular project? Why do we give to particular sorts of things? Is it for the sake of the things surviving to the next generation, or is it for the sake of us becoming the kind of people that we are, that God has called us to be? And I think that wealth can be used toward that second end, toward being the kind of people that God has called us to be. But I think the real temptation is, we just want this thing to keep going. We want this thing to continue to survive. This is a good thing for its own sake, and it needs to keep going, right? And I think that if we pursue that, it's a real missed opportunity. The second type, I think, is one we've touched on a bit, is just to say, there's some that are just kind of gonna ignore it, that are gonna kind of just pretend like this isn't happening, that this is just kind of a blip in the radar, and we'll kind of move past it. We'll continue to just carry on business as usual. God's presence is linked to faithfulness and abundance, and yes, we'll have kind of low times, but good times are around the corner. I'm thinking, well, maybe this is true. Right? I don't think that's a particularly wise approach, and I think that as we've already kind of indicated, there's some fault lines there that need to be looked at. The third option, I think, is one that may face a lot more congregations will face, and that is that in scarce conditions, there just may not be enough to go forward. So my church is interesting, kind of has watched this happen. My church is actually fine, but in the last few years, there was a dwindling congregation just a block away from ours that eventually decided they were that they were just going to close up shop. Like, there were about 20 people left, and the property was more than they needed. And so they actually sold it to our church, and we have repurposed that building space to expand homeless ministries and to do job training and community outreach. We had kind of a smaller space that we were using that, and so this former church has now kind of expanded social services that our church is providing. But that story of a church that is dwindling in size and just materially doesn't know what to do with it next. I think this is where the third option comes in, is that it may just be the end for some churches, and then that brings up a whole lot of other conversations about, okay, so what does this mean about God's faithfulness to us? What do we do with this, which once blessed a whole lot of people, but now is not really being used for much of anything in particular? Like, how do we end well? How do we move forward in this sort of scenario? Right. And I think that too is, this is something I think you're exploring in a long format, which I love, because I think this is a necessary conversation.
Yeah. There's in a scarce environment, there will not be enough resources to sustain all the churches that are out there, and we're seeing that right now. The question becomes, when do you make the determination that it is time to wrap up? And then increasingly, I'm going to dare to say, options will get more limited. There will be less churches like yours that are willing to take on a building.
Right. Yep, that's right.
Because there's fewer church plants than there are churches that are going to close, and so there's going to come a point where it's going to get hard to actually give away a building. Let's talk about rural churches. I wanted to circle back to that, because that kind of caught me off guard. You said that scarcity is familiar to small and rural churches. And what surprised me about that was because, like I alluded to earlier, I think of declining churches as big steeple, mainline in cities, and less. And I think, I guess maybe because I'm in the South, but I think of that less as, the Bible Belt churches out in the country, but
Right.
you're saying they've practiced scarcity for a while. Tell me
I
about it.
think in part because I'm thinking of a few different ones that are close to me. That these are all in towns of 5,000 people. You might have a couple of churches in town, and they might have had a heyday, but over time, demographically, what we're seeing in most situations is that the migration is happening from more rural places to cities. In some cities, we're seeing kind of the reverse of that. But I think that's still kind of like state to state migration, not overall a shift away from large urban centers to rural spaces. I think that the migration, the demographic changes are still it smaller locations, or people are moving from smaller towns to larger places. This is where the job opportunities are. This is where the food is. This is where your connections are. This is where things are. Um, and so I think churches in those situations have always had to kind of live on less and learn how to get by with fewer things and to be more focused and honed with respect to the things that they give themselves to. That there might be any number of possibilities that people would approach them with, but they've had to operate with a sense of wisdom about which of those things is the first priority and which of those things might be a later priority, but not now. So I think that dynamic will only be accelerated as you continue to see kind of these smaller towns continue to decline in population. So that all of these other factors that we've kind of talked about will come to bear on smaller towns, and they'll come to bear on smaller towns pretty quickly. So learning from the ways in which I think rural churches have always had to live under this kind of shadow, I think will be a really important thing for most churches going forward. And I think, and they kind of indicate this in the article as well. I think learning from the ways in which churches outside of the U.S. and outside of like the West in general will also be really instructive. The churches thrive and go on for a long period of time and do great work, but they do it in situations where the building is built out of cinder blocks, or the building is built out of the building is someone's home, where the resources we're talking about are in maybe the thousands, but not the tens of thousands or the hundreds of thousands. Where much of the work is done by laity and volunteers, and it's not done by highly educated paid professionals. So I think being able to learn from the way in which churches have dealt with this in lots of other contexts, like outside of large urban situations, will be really instructive for churches going forward.
Yeah,
so that's just a hunch, but I don't think I'm wrong.
Yeah, the demographics are shifting in rural versus city, and we have two problems going on at the same time that overlap. Somebody might be listening to this and be like, well, my church is full. I don't understand. Why are we scarce? Well, the problem is most people who go to church in America today are going to larger churches, but the larger churches only make up like 9 or 10% of the number of churches in America. So everything's consolidated.
The large churches consolidate in ways that like obscure our vision to the reality that most churches that exist are pretty small, right? 50 to 100 people. So
meanwhile, the entire population as a whole is going to church less and attending, and even beyond just Christianity, even in other religions, it's going down. So about that, what excites me most about your work, and I want to definitely keep following, is what you just said about looking outside of our culture and time period for inspiration, because that's where we're going to have to look. So do you mean, well, I threw out time period, but I guess I should ask for clarity on that. Looking outside of culture in the present day, or looking at other time periods in church history, or both? Where do you look?
I hadn't thought about that, but I think that there's plenty of examples historically of how churches have navigated this. how churches have navigated this in other time periods. I'm thinking now of the ways in which you had, and perhaps this is more of a, I don't know. I'm going to rephrase what I was just saying. I was going to say that this is more of like there might be more Protestant examples, but I don't think that that's true. There's plenty of stories that we have and anecdotes that we have of like small Catholic parishes surviving for a long period of time when there's very, very little, like very poor parishes.
That's a great point. We don't think of the Catholics as missionaries, but they really were for many.
Oh yeah,
for
in many places.
Yeah.
So I think that I think it would take a little bit of digging, but I don't think it would be very hard to come up with just a handful of examples that would really be instructive for people to learn from. And you could do that pretty easily just from the journals that are out there and the diaries that people kept and the stories that people have left behind about what kind of ordinary congregational life looked like and how they actually did this. I think there's inspiration to be found. I think we just have to look for it. So
yeah. Well, and we have to change our mindset from going back to that quasi prosperity gospel. Why would we look outside of the American church if we're the most abundant? We've obviously been doing this the best. Who do we learn from? We've got to change that mindset to, okay, well, we can learn from other periods. So speaking of that, the American church's historic abundance, particularly the 20th century forward, is that the outlier in terms of the church's total history, or is it the norm?
Yeah.
You think it's the outlier?
Yeah. I think it's an outlier.
What makes
even the abundance that we've experienced with like numerical abundance and financial abundance that we've experienced the last 70 years, I think is largely an outlier. So historians of religion have shown that basically in the U.S. since the Second World War, the rise in church attendance that you see post Second World War and kind of on, basically we've been living on the kind of the social capital and the religious attendance like since that time period, and that it's gone down incrementally with every kind of passing decade. You have kind of like periods of brief resurgence, but more or less you can kind of track kind of a slow graduated kind of coming down off of a post Second World War high ever since the 1950s. So I think that what we're coming back toward in some ways is more the norm and kind of getting back to more of a historical norm. I do think that there are some new wrinkles and some new challenges that are coming, insofar as we have not seen heretofore like a percentage of the population that was just not interested at all in attending church or having no religious affiliation like we have seen now.
Yeah.
And so you couple those two things together, and I do think that there's some analogies that we can draw from the past, but I think that the fact that we're now in a different kind of cultural moment when religious faith is an option to be exercised and not necessarily like the default of an American culture. I think that creates some new challenges ahead, right? That maybe there's some things definitely we can learn from the past, but not all analogies can be brought forward.
Oh, that's a good point. That is a very good point. Last thing, and I didn't have this in my notes, but you started out by talking about pastors, the scarcity of staff resources. And of course, my understanding is that definitely got worse in COVID. The Great Resignation hit churches as well during that time. But also there's, the number one budget item for just about any church is going to be your personnel, right? Your staff.
That's right.
It is much easier to debate, like you said, the use of a gym and how to consolidate that and what those physical resources look like for a church. It is much harder to make the cut of who gets to stay and who we have to let go.
Of people.
So, I mean, what is your prognosis for that? Should we be investing more in lay ministers? Should we be recruiting different types of pastors?
Yeah, I think it comes in maybe a couple of different ways. One is at the seminary level, preparing future ministers to be bivocational. this is, again, kind of a model that has worked for a very long time in a lot of rural contexts and a lot of international contexts, is that more often than not is the case that ministers have like another job that they do in addition to being a minister, right? So I think that there is a long history going back a couple of 100 years, particularly in the U.S., of thinking of ministers as professionals, which comes with it a kind of a certain expectation with respect to this will be the sole career that you have, as opposed to this is a vocation that we carry in addition to another set of skills that I have that help like pay the bills, right? So I think on the one level, it will require a new attention to helping ministers to reckon with the fact that they may have to be bivocational in some form or fashion. I think it'll also involve training up and calling out those members of the laity who are already there, who can function as leadership and helping, not just assuming that because they are willing to show up that is sufficient, but rather in like helping to prepare them and to equip them in ways that will be really beneficial to them going forward.
It was wonderful talking with you. Thank you so much for the time. I'm going to keep following your research.
Thank you so much for having me on, Matt.
Great interest. We should talk again. So
okay,
I appreciate it.
Sounds good.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to my conversation with Dr. Myles Werntz. Here are my 3 key takeaways from this episode. Number 1, scarcity is becoming a widespread issue for churches across denominations. It's affecting resources, attendance, and even staffing. Unfortunately, this trend is likely to continue, but it does not mean that we have done something wrong or that God is any less faithful. Number 2, churches may need to consider new models of ministry, including bivocational pastors, increased lay leadership, and resource sharing between congregations to effectively navigate the scarce conditions. And number 3, while challenging, scarcity can provide unexpected benefits, such as increased focus, empathy, and creativity in problem solving. It may also foster the development of important virtues like courage and patience. Those are my 3 takeaways for this episode. I hope this episode brought you wisdom, inspiration, and peace. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our podcast and stay updated on upcoming episodes. Please take a moment to leave a review. It helps us grow and reach more listeners who might benefit from these conversations. If you have been a part of a church closing or consolidation, I want to hear your story. Reach out to me at lastservicepodcast@gmail.com. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. This is not the end.